All right, the clock has ticked over and the mechanism seems to be working. For those worried about the mics, I'm going to try to stay close to this so I'm not wandering all over the place. It's all about the sound, you know. Welcome to not quite the Lubar Center downstairs, but our Lubar Center's programming on a wide variety of public affairs here in the state. And the poll is just one of the many programs we do on various topics. I'm pleased to see you all and delighted to have you here. I guess I have to both introduce myself and introduce the poll and then answer the questions that in the past Mike or Alan would be asking me at this point. So I guess it's time to take off the training wheels and do this on my own. So welcome to the 71st Marquette Law School poll of Wisconsin. We've done more polls total, but this is the 71st of the statewide polls. So let's go through the agenda for the day, the methodology of the poll, which we'll always introduce, of course. Then we'll take a look at general election matchups. Who knew that we had a primary? It's time to move on to the general. Certainty of voting, because there's been a lot of talk about the enthusiasm gap, if there is a gap, and what effect that might have. The candidate images, now that we have nominees from both parties, time to take a look at how voters see them and think about them. Issue concerns, the top issues for the state. This is something we've been polling about for more than 12 months, looking at what issues concern voters here in the state. So I'll take you through some of those. What people think about abortion and the January 6th committee specifically. And then other issues where people stand on some of the issues that we face as a state and as a nation. And that'll wrap us up. So the methodology, don't get ahead of yourself. So we were in the field the 10th through the 15th. So we obviously waited until the primary was done, but we went in the field last Wednesday evening after the primary, and we wrapped up the polling this Monday night. Usually we wrap up on Sunday because we start on Tuesday, but those pesky primaries get in the way. So we were a day later in the field than usual. 75% of respondents interviewed by cell phone, 25% by landline. I just, as a side issue, mentioned that our cell phone sample now includes people who've moved into the state but kept their out-of-state numbers. And so that now makes up 16% of the state. And we're capturing that in our polling, something that's not been done before. All because John Johnson, my colleague, refused to change his phone number. So we had to make him eligible for the poll this way. The upshot of all of this is that the margin of error for the full sample is 4.2 percentage points. Some questions are half sample and have a little bit larger margin of error. But half sample gets us a chance to ask more questions than we would otherwise. So that's that. The partisan makeup of the sample, as always. This time it's 30% Republican, 29% Democratic, and 41% independent. If you look at those who lean to a party and count them as partisans, then it's 45 Republican, 44 Dem, and 9% independent. Just mention, because it's sort of a curiosity to me, that those who lean Republican make up about 16% of the total sample. Those who lean Democratic make up about 16% of the sample. And overall, 71 polls we've done, those two numbers stay awfully close to each other. In an individual sample, they might not be exactly 16-16, but it is pretty striking that the leaners are awfully evenly balanced, just as that 30-29 is awfully evenly balanced in the people that just straight up call themselves Democrats or Republicans. And the long run party balance is very similar since January of 2020, 30 Republican, 28 Dem, 41 independent, and the with leaners matches what we have in this sample too. So that's the deal. So let's get to the big news. What's the state of the races? And the state of the race for governor is close. I know that's a shock to everyone because we're so unaccustomed to close races here. Evers with a little bit of an edge, 45 to 43 against Michaels. Joan Beglincher is an independent candidate who qualified for the ballot and was certified by the Elections Commission. So we included her on the vote choice question. She gets 7% in this survey. And then 3% say they don't know and 2% say they refused. A side note is if you put Beglincher and don't know and refuse together, you get 12% not choosing one of the two-party candidates. In June, before we had nominees, and when we didn't include Beglincher before the primaries and before the general election ballot was set, the percentage not choosing one of the two main party candidates was also 12%. So the group of people that are looking for alternatives to the two party candidates looks like it really didn't shift between June and now, and really didn't shift with the addition of a third party independent. It looks like she simply picked up 7%, a healthy share of that 12% that we're looking for alternatives, but it didn't shift the balance of the percentage of people choosing Evers or Michaels. Now, this is a closer race than we saw in June when Evers had about a 7-point lead over Michaels and a 4-point lead over Clayfish at that point. And here you can see the tightening of the race. The fact that there's all that white space off to the right might suggest to you that you'll see this chart again between now and November as we fill in the upcoming surveys, but this will give us a consistent way of looking at the trends over okay, I'll give it away. We'll be doing 3 more polls between now and November. So there will become 3 more data points on this list or on this chart. But you can see the tightening of the race. We'll get into some of the reasons that's going on in a minute when we dig a little bit deeper. Now, whereas the governor's race is quite close and is tightened, the Senate race has actually widened a little bit, with Mandela Barnes holding a 7-point lead over Johnson. That was a 2-point lead in June. So stretched out just a little bit. And like I said, we'll see what's going on in a minute. And you can see that very few people are saying they don't want either candidate. That's a volunteered response, but some people say that. 3% say they don't know, 1% refuse. So this is sort of an unusually small percentage of undecideds. Again, we'll get into those numbers just a little bit, but this is a improvement in Mandela Barnes's standing and advantage over Senator Johnson. Here's that same trend chart, and you can see the shift from the 2-point lead to the 7-point now. Now, a little bit about what's going on under the hood. You'll see this for both the governor's race and the Senate race, that the parties are extremely strongly unified behind their nominees. So for the governor's race, Tony Evers is getting 91% of Democratic voters, and Tim Michaels is getting 89% of Republicans, just a 2-point difference there in party loyalty. Look at the crossover vote, that little red bar off to the far left. That's the 6% of Republicans that say they're voting for Evers, and the low blue bar over in the center, 4% of Democrats voting for Tim Michaels. So very little difference in crossover, just a slightly bigger crossover from Republican to Evers, but the margin of error, remember, is 4 points, so don't make much of a 2-point difference like that. It's the independents here that are particularly noteworthy. 41% for Evers, 37% for Michaels, just a 4-point difference there. That small advantage Evers has with independents, the very small greater party loyalty difference, the 2.891 to 89 difference, tiny 2-point crossover vote, Those are the things that manufacture that 2-point Evers advantage in the overall race. You can see how easily that could change. Independents are actually kind of independent, and they could shift between now and November. But the balance that gives Evers this little bit of an edge comes from slightly better party loyalty, but only slightly, and a little bit better, but only 4 points better performance among independents. You can see that Beglincher's strength is right where you'd expect it to be, the 12% of people who say they're independent and say, therefore, I'll vote for an independent candidate, 12 points, and lower 4 and 3 with partisans for Beglincher. Look at the Senate race, though, and you see where the difference is and why Barnes is up by 7 while Evers is up by 2. The party loyalty is also very similar and very high. 95% of Dems for Barnes, 92% of Republicans for Johnson. So there is no noticeable difference in enchantment with the party nominee. There's slightly more Republican crossover to Barnes at 7 versus 4% Democrats to Johnson. But look at the difference in independents here compared to the 4-point advantage Evers had. It's a 14-point advantage for Barnes, 52 to 38. And remember, these are exactly the same people who call themselves independents answering these 2 questions. So Barnes is getting a nice post-primary bump. Not with partisans, because in June, partisans were very united behind Barnes as well in the hypothetical matchup. But he's getting it from independents. And as we look into candidate images in a minute, you'll see this replicated about why it is that Barnes is doing better with independents. And in the Evers race, a small advantage with independents, but in the Barnes race, the Senate race, a much more noticeable advantage, at least for now. Okay, now, certainty of voting. We've talked a lot about enthusiasm and the enthusiasm gap, but now that we're into the general election, we're going to shift to paying more attention to how certain you are to vote rather than just your enthusiasm about voting. Ultimately, what matters is showing up at the polls, and the people who says, I am absolutely sure I'm going to vote, are your best bet for people that actually show up. Even those who say I'm very likely to vote drop off a good bit, and anybody that says less than very likely has a pretty low chance of voting. So we're going to talk about certainty. I'll circle back and, well, I'll go ahead and introduce it now. The enthusiasm gap had been small in the winter and spring, with at most a 2 to 4 point advantage for Republicans. In June, we saw that tick up quite a bit for the first time. But in this poll, Republican enthusiasm didn't change and Democratic enthusiasm went up 9 points. So the two have not quite converged, but they're similar. All those results are in our top lines on the website and in the crosstabs, so you can go and see them. But I want to focus on that more important question, showing up at the polls, rather than being thrilled to go there or grudgingly showing up. It matters if you show up. So what do we get? Certainty to vote is now almost dead even. 83% of Republican registered voters, remember, this is all registered voters. 83% of Republicans say they're absolutely certain to vote. 82% of Democrats do. That also closes, well, we didn't ask this last time, but it follows with the enthusiasm closing that the certainty of vote is so close. 66% of independents absolutely certain. That's completely normal. Independents as a group are less excited about politics, less involved in politics, somewhat more disgruntled about the parties and so on. And so you almost always see independents a good ways back. But the party balance now is pretty much dead even. Shade advantage to Republicans. And in the very likely group, there is a little bit of a Republican advantage, 11 to 8. So the question of mobilization becomes a real one here. If you mobilize those folks that are just not quite absolutely certain, maybe you'd bring in a 3-point advantage to the Republicans there. Turnout, turnout, turnout. I'm sure the parties don't need me to tell them that getting their voters to the polls matters. But here I think you see it starts off with a pretty even footing now, despite the enthusiasm gap we saw in June. It looks more like what we were seeing in the winter and spring without much of an enthusiasm gap. What does this matter in terms of vote choice? Because if you have gaps in turnout, then you can get differences between the numbers I showed you a minute ago for the horse race, which were for the registered voters, all of them. So let's look at this. So here's the vote for governor. The green bars are all registered voters. These are the same numbers I showed you a minute ago. The purple bar is for the folks who say they're either absolutely certain to vote or very likely to vote. And then finally, the tan bar is for those who say they're absolutely certain to vote. This is the group that we usually define as likely voters in our surveys, okay? And so in the governor's race, the 2-point registered voter margin for Evers is still a 2-point vote margin if you remove the people who say I'm less than very likely to vote, and you just look at the very likely and the absolutely certain. And finally, in the tan, with, again, the traditional likely voter criterion, it bumps up by a couple of points to a 4-point Evers lead among likely voters. You saw that there's not much of a partisan gap here. Part of this reflects how people vote within those category of likely voters. And a 2-point shift is not much of a shift, but it does show, at least at the moment, that the most enthusiastic, most certain to vote, I shouldn't have said enthusiastic, the most certain to vote folks are just marginally more pro-Evers than is the registered voters as a whole. You can also see over to the right on Beglincher's vote that as you go from the full registered voters, her vote is 7. Then as you look at the somewhat more likely, it goes to 5. And then among the most likely, it comes down to 4. And so again, this is sort of what you would expect of someone that is getting more support from independents, and independents in general are less likely to vote, which again, you saw a minute ago. On the Senate, don't make no never mind. It's a 7-point lead among all registered voters. It's a 7-point lead of certain and likely, and it's a 7-point lead among likely voters, absolutely certain to vote. So here in this case, there wasn't much difference in the governor's race, but there's no difference at all in the Senate race, at least again at this point. So that's in one sense reassuring, if you want to think of it this way. Turnout will ultimately make a big difference because who votes matters. But at the moment, it doesn't look like the results are terribly sensitive to the amount of turnout that we would see. Now, stay tuned in September and October and the 1st of November to see whether that persists or not, because campaigns matter. But at the moment, turnout doesn't look like it's a huge advantage to either party. Okay, so what do the people think about these candidates? So we ask a question, does Tony Evers someone who cares about people like you or not? And the same question for Michaels, and of course, the same questions in the Senate race. And what you see is Evers has a strong advantage here, far stronger than his vote advantage, of people saying he cares about people like you rather than not. With Tim Michaels, it's dead even. But the biggest point I want to stress is how much, oh, look, someone's calling me. How interesting. Good, I'm muted, right? Because that would have been really embarrassing. The big point I want to emphasize here is look at the incumbent versus the non-incumbent on this gray bar over to the right. 23%, a quarter, don't know whether Tim Michels cares about them or not, but it's less than 10% that think they know whether Tony Evers cares about them or not. This is not unusual, of course. People have been getting to know Michels all summer, and they're still getting to know him. You'll see more about that in a second. Whereas they've had Evers for 4 years. And so this is not a surprise, but campaigns matter. What happens with that 23% between now and November as they come to form impressions of Tim Michels? Do they develop positive images, in which case his balance of cares and not cares is going to improve for him? Do they develop negative images, in which case that'll go down? With Evers, that can still change because campaigns matter, but you're working off a base that's less than half of the number of don't know respondents for the incumbent. Same thing happens with the reverse of party in the Senate campaign. Barnes has a really positive image right now, but also has 23% of voters who say they don't know if he cares about them or not. Whereas Johnson is very similar to Evers in the 10% that don't know what they think about him caring, but is underwater. Unlike Michels, who was dead even on this measure, Johnson's actually 8 points underwater. So fewer people who can be given a first impression of him, that is, don't knows who might form an opinion, but it's a smaller group of people in that category. Barnes opens the campaign with a really positive image here, but as with Michels, 1 in 4 voters don't know. So there's room for that to change, either to get better or to get worse. And of course, campaigns have 2 sides, and we'll be telling 2 rather different stories about all of these candidates. So what happens to the don't knows is really worth watching. Another question we asked is this candidate someone who shares your values or not? Trying to get a little bit away from the emotive part and a little bit more to the value politics that we hear a lot about. Here, Evers still has a bit of an advantage and about 9% that don't know. And Michels is, again, dead even, 38-38 on shares values, and still 23% don't know. For those of a dubious aspect who doubt these things, you might notice that the Michels slide here looks just like the Michels slide before. This scared me so much last night that I went back to check the numbers. And I still checked them with John this morning to make sure that an independent eye found them. They really are the same percentages. If you drill down, there are 2 or 3 respondents that are different on the 2 questions. So it really is real. But like I said, it made me check it twice and then a 3rd time. I think part of this is simply the folks that don't have opinions about these candidates don't have opinions about them, whether it's cares or shares. So again, Michels has the opportunity to convert some of those don't knows into positive shares my values. Evers has less room to move there, but starts off with more of an advantage. The negative campaign may shift people on either of these candidates. With Barnes, again, a similar picture. Net positive on shares values, but 1 in 4 don't have an opinion. Johnson, net negative on shares values, but with a smaller percentage who don't have an opinion. Okay. One of the questions we ask all the time is favorability to these candidates. And here, Evers' net favorability is not as strong net positive as either shares or cares, but it is net positive by 5 points. And here you can see 6% haven't heard enough, which still remains a head scratcher, but people pick it, and 6% don't know. And on Michels, even again at 33 apiece on favorables, but with 34%, now a full third that aren't able to answer the question of do they have a favorable or unfavorable view of him. So lots and lots of room for the campaign. With Barnes, it's even higher, 41% don't have a favorable or unfavorable view of him, Though of those people that do have a view, it's quite strongly net favorable, in keeping with the slides you saw a minute ago. And finally, with Senator Johnson, after 6 years in office and seeking a third term, it's still 15% that say they don't have an opinion of whether they have a favorable or unfavorable view of him. But he's net negative 38-47. That's about where he's been, about the same. It's not much change from last time of net negative. I should just say a technical thing. We ask favorability early in the survey, and we ask the cares and shares much later in the survey. So when you're asked favorability about these people, they're simply named. We don't add Senator Ron Johnson, just favorable or unfavorable of Ron Johnson, of Tammy Baldwin, of Tony Evers, of Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, and so on. So people pretty quickly get the idea of we're talking about politicians, but they're not given the cues in the favorability about who Tim Michels is or who Mandela Barnes is. We do that deliberately because the don't knows here are telling you something about name recognition without any cues. But the cares and shares questions come after we've done the vote choice and some other items. And so by that point, people know fully who these folks are. So you get a little lower don't know rate, 23% or so on these non-incumbents on the cares and shares, even though you're up in the 30s, or in Barnes's case, 41%, when people aren't cued ahead of time as to who they are. But that's a deliberate strategy to measure slightly different things. Okay. So again, why is Barnes ahead and why is Evers just a little bit ahead? Well, whether it's cares about you, shares my values, or favorability, the two Democrats have net advantages on that. The two Republicans are dead even in Michael's case, or a bit negative in Johnson's case. Let's look a little bit at Tony Evers' job approval. In these charts and through the rest of the presentation, the tan bar on the left is the overall opinion of all registered voters, and then the breakdowns in the red, purple, and blue bars are by party. So Evers' job approval this month is 47 approved, 45 disapproved. That's 1 point tighter than it was in June. There's a huge partisan split, no surprise there, in opinion about him. And among those independents in the purple bars, it's 6 points more approved than disapproved, 47-41. Again, in keeping with some of the other things you saw, but where does the balance of opinion come from? Comes from those independents who are a little bit more favorable to Evers. Whereas the Democrats 89 approve, Republicans 87 disapprove. There's hardly any daylight, though, opposite opinions from those two. Even in the 8% of Republicans who approve, there's 7% of Democrats who disapprove. So again, not much partisan effect here. Here's the trend in Evers' job approval since he took office. And you can see initially people are just getting to know him, so the don't know line plummets at the beginning. Then COVID hits in 2020 and approval shoots up and then gradually comes down. This year, what we've seen is a tightening of the net approval. It's so nice to be able to just walk over here and point to this. Here's the beginning of 2022. And it's gone from a 9-point net approval to a 6, to a 3, to a 2. So it's been tightening over that time. On the other hand, we've only had one poll since he took office where there was more disapproval than approval. And that was here in October of last year when it was 1 point net negative. So Evers has enjoyed net positive approval with that one exception. But you can see in this campaign year that margin is tightening quite a bit. And at a +2, there's not much room for error there. That's a pretty evenly balanced approval score. We'll see how he weathers the campaign and whether the campaign ultimately boosts his performance, because that can happen in campaigns, or ultimately damages it. Okay, let's talk about issues. We love the horse race, even if we devote most of our questions each survey to issues. So since last year, every poll, so goodness, however many that now amounts to, 7, 8, something like that, we ask people, how concerned are you with a set of issues? And they're, I think, fairly obvious issues that people are concerned about. But here's where that stands this month in August. So over here to the far right is inflation as the champion of issue concerns, as it has been most of, if not all of the year, followed by gun violence and crime. I'm reading right to left. Then abortion policy. So there's been obviously a lot of attention to abortion, and we'll come to some questions about that in a minute. But you see, it's pretty high, but it's the 4th highest level of concern, not the top. And then public schools, very close to that, followed by a drop off to taxes, then climate change, illegal immigration, very close to one another, and then nobody cares about coronavirus anymore. Okay. Now, that inflation number is really interesting, because when we asked about it last August, less than half of the people said they were very concerned about it. And that has grown over time. So surprise, concern about inflation actually dipped this month. Not by a lot, it didn't drop to 0. But for the first time in a year, instead of continuing to go up, concern fell off a bit. Now, I don't make causal claims here, but remember that we have seen gas prices come down during the last month. We did see the consumer price index, calculated by the government, remained flat from June to July instead of going up. And so just as a student of public opinion and public perceptions, it's kind of nice to see if gas prices went down and inflation didn't go up by as much. Looks like the public kind of responded to that just a little bit. Doesn't mean they've quit being concerned, doesn't mean this year's prices aren't more than last year's prices. So concern is perfectly reasonable. But there's a little bit of a dip there. And in a world where people see all kinds of stuff through partisan lenses, it's refreshing to see people respond to, change in the macro environment a little bit. Now, thing about issues is not everybody's equally concerned about the same issues. And so I've broken these 9 issues down by party to look at which partisans are more concerned with an issue and less concerned. So here you go, and let's walk through what this shows. Over there on the top left is the inflation concern, and the left bullet for Republicans is up over 90% of Republicans saying they're very concerned with inflation. Then that drops to the mid-60s for independents and drops to the low 40s for Democrats. So there is quite a difference in concern for inflation based on party. By the way, these are sorted from the top left to the bottom right by how partisan they are. The most pro-Republican concern is the top left. The most Democratic concern is the bottom right. And so there's quite a gap there. This is a good example where, unless there are Republican gas stations and Republican grocery stores and a different set of Democratic gas stations and stores with much lower prices, if so, I'd like to find them. This is clearly, surely, not because the economic environment is that dramatically different for Democrats and Republicans, but it's a good example of partisanship structuring our views. Having said that, remember, it did come down overall last month. So there is sort of something going on that's not just partisan projection. Then the next highest gap here is on immigration, illegal immigration, with Republicans ranking that quite high, falls off with independents, falls further with Democrats. Big gap here. And so when you actually, day before yesterday, I think it was, Senator Johnson had an event talking about illegal immigration. Well, why is a Republican candidate doing something on illegal immigration? It reflects the concern of the partisans in the GOP really well, even as Democrats say it's not an important issue, hardly important at all, really, if you look at how low that Democratic dot is in here. I won't go through every one of these in that kind of detail, but look at taxes, much more of a concern for Republicans than Democrats. Republicans have been talking some about tax reform and reducing income tax or even eliminating it in the state. So you see a big gap here that makes perfect sense. Crime, there's a difference with Republicans rating it higher, but independents and Democrats are about equal to one another and not dramatically falling off steadily. They're just lower in a plateau. Public schools are a concern to everybody, about equally. Now, people may want different things for public schools depending on their party, but there's about an equal concern there. Coronavirus, I joke that nobody cares about it. It turns out Democrats do care about it. This is the case where now we flipped, and it's now Democrats being more concerned than Republicans are. And Democrats are quite a bit more concerned with coronavirus than either independents or Republicans. Gun violence is a Democratic issue and not a Republican issue. Look just above it on crime, where there was a modest greater Republican concern, but if we call it gun violence, Republicans aren't bothered by it and Democrats are hugely bothered by it. Abortion policy, big partisan divide here. It's interesting that Republicans rate it as low as they do, given the role that pro-life politics has played in GOP politics for so long. And then finally, climate change is just the greatest example here of partisan divides. Barely 1 in 10 Republicans say it's very important, and it is the highest issue of concern for Democrats. In the press release, but not in the slides, you'll see a table that sorts this by Republican concern, and then a table that sorts it by Democratic concern. Climate change is at the very top of the Democratic table, even higher than abortion. It's the very bottom of the Republican table. And so again, thinking about who's talking about climate change, if Ron Johnson is holding illegal immigration events, I would predict Democrats hold climate change events in speaking to their base. So I think these are really interesting. They say different things as we get to the next set of tables about particular issue concerns. It also says something about the prospects for governing, whether we're talking about in the state or whether we're talking about the US Senate, depending on which party holds the majority there, that the parties really do care about different issues and they have very different views on some, but fun coming, don't quit yet. We've still got more to go. There are a few things they actually agree on. So, oh my goodness, stay tuned. All right, so let's look at the two big national events of the summer, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and the January 6th committee hearings. And then we'll come to some other issues. So first of all, practically everybody's heard about the Supreme Court decision. That's true across the parties, where we're looking at over 3/4 of the people in every party group saying they've heard a lot about the court's decision. And very few people in any group say they haven't heard anything at all. And so this is by far the most salient issue we've seen. You'll see a similar chart in a minute for the January 6th hearings. And not to give too much away, it's not as high as this. Okay. What about overturning Roe versus Wade? 33% of the public at large, all registered voters, favored the decision to overturn Roe. 60% opposed it. I'd mentioned that's in line with our polling for a decade in which we've shown low 60s who say they think abortion should be legal in all or most cases. about a third or so saying it should be illegal in all or most cases. So the opinion here doesn't look like it shifted in any dramatic way from what we've been seeing for really a decade on this question. There's a big party gap. And so almost 2/3 of Republicans favor the decision to overturn Roe. 92% of Democrats oppose it. Think about who cares more about this issue, at least at the moment. Democrats ranking it much higher. But then I think that important group of independents is going nearly to, well, actually exactly 2-1. 62% oppose overturning, 31% in favor. And so I don't think in one sense this is at all new. If you've paid attention to our 10 years or more of polling on the question, the party gaps also line up with what we've seen. So reaction to the decision was in line with those longstanding views of the public. And again, if you think about governing, whether it's the legislature and the governor next year, or whether it's the US Senate, clearly responding to your base of supporters would produce dramatically different policy outcomes based on these data. Here's that policy question we've asked for 10 years. Should it be legal in all cases, abortion legal in all cases, 30%, legal in most, 35%, illegal in most, 25%, and illegal in all cases, 5%. The one important shift here is something unusual because we've seen no big trend on this question for a decade, but the percent saying legal in all or legal in most did go up a few points, and the percent saying illegal in all cases fell from 11 to 5 in these 2 months. We asked this question last time as well. And it fell across the board. Republicans became less likely to say illegal in all. So did independents, and Democrats were already low, but fell off as well. So I think there has been a modest shift on this when we asked the same questions both times. And in the end, basically 65% legal in all or most, 30% illegal in all or most. That 30 is down just a little bit, and the 65 is a little bit up from the 59 or 60 that we've been seeing. What about abortion in cases of rape or incest? This is that case where everybody agrees. 88% say there should be an exception for rape or incest in abortion laws. But that's 79% of Republicans that say that, 87% of independents, and 97% of Democrats. So here's a real legislative issue that will face the new governor, even if it's the old governor, whoever wins the governorship will face the legislature. And it's one where the base of the party, no matter which party you're talking about, has a pretty clear position on this issue. So how the candidates campaign on the issue, what they say about their abortion policy going forward in the new year, I think will be very interesting. And it's kind of striking that the party gaps that we see that are so big on whether Roe should have been overturned, where a majority of Republicans agree it should have been overturned, and where there's a big gap on legal in all or most or illegal in all or most by party, doesn't show up in this rape and incest exception. So something to pay attention to going forward, and again, a rare case where there's not much of a party divide on the issue. How about the January 6th hearings? Remember, heard about the abortion decision was over 75%. Here it's over 50%. That's still a lot of attention to any news event, but it's 57% who've heard a lot about those hearings. It's higher for Democrats at 70 than the 53 for Republicans. So there's a gap there, but it's interesting because it's showing us that it's not the case that people are super selective in their attention. Among Republicans, there's slightly less attention, but it's still a majority who say they've heard a lot about the hearings. And if you go over to the far right, nothing at all. The parties are about the same, 14 and 11, a little higher for independents. So January 6 hearings aren't getting the same takeaways by both parties, but they are getting a fair bit of attention to them, no matter which party. How about Trump's responsibility for the violence on January 6? Here, the party difference comes back in full force. 47% overall say he bears a lot of responsibility, 19% just a little, and 31% say nothing at all, no responsibility at all. But for Republicans, it's just 8% a lot and 62% none at all. For Democrats, 89% a lot and 2% none at all. And independents, again, who matter, 46% a lot, 22% some, and 29% none at all. So both Democrats and Republicans are being exposed to the January 6 hearings. They're hearing a lot about it. But the reaction, the takeaway on Trump in particular is very, very different. No surprise there. How about accuracy of the 2020 election? We've been asking about this for quite a while. 48% say they're very confident in the outcome, 18% somewhat confident, falls off to 15% not to, and 17% not at all. That roughly 2/3 confident, 1/3 not confident has been with us for a year, or since 2021, since we first started asking that question. And so there's a big gap there. Partisan differences are strong, slightly more muted than they have been. If you look at the Republicans, 25 not to, 37 not at all. So that's 62% not confident. We've seen that up a little north of 2/3 not confident. It's a small shift, and I'm certainly not ready to say it's a meaningful shift. Let's watch this for a while. It's a little bit lower than it was before. And Democrats and independents are quite confident in the election. That really hadn't changed much. How about Donald Trump's favorability? 38% have a favorable view of him, 57% unfavorable. Very few people lack an opinion about the former president. But here, too, the party gap is enormous. 77% of Republicans say they have a favorable view of Trump, just 15% unfavorable. In the wake of his endorsement and appearance in the governor's race and other comments about state politics, it probably is not surprising that within the party, he is very positive, seen very favorably. And I think it bears mention, enormously favorable. There are not very many figures that are at 77-15 within their party. So that's a really strong thing. And of course, Democrats are the opposite. But again, those independents, 1/3 favorable, nearly 2/3 unfavorable. So quite a gap in perception of him between in the party and not. Would you like Trump to run again in 24? Here, Republicans are still a majority, but it drops to 59%. So that's an interesting gap to see how it develops from 77% saying I'm favorable to him to 59% I'd like him to run again. Well, 59% will definitely get you the nomination, right? But the slippage between 77 favorable and 59 is something I think we'd want to pay some attention to. And again, big majorities of independents don't want him to run again. And again, unsurprisingly, even more so for the Democrats. So let's get through a few more issues and wrap up. Paid parental leave came up in the debate. Everybody's calling me. I don't know why. Paid parental leave came up in the gubernatorial debate. And I was surprised that if I heard it right, all three of the Republican candidates said they favored some form of parental leave. They didn't specify a white paper position about exactly what it would be. But it did make me want to ask it this time. And what we found, and this question is framed, you can look it up on the survey or on the website, whether businesses should be required to provide paid family leave for fathers and mothers of new babies. Okay. And so you get 78% in favor of that. But 65% of Republicans, even though the question is framed in terms of requiring businesses to do something. Now, again, I want to stress, I don't think that was clear what exactly the Republican gubernatorial debate candidates were saying about that. But I still think it was interesting and a little surprising. And here in the data, even more so, because usually government regulation of business is not a huge seller with Republicans, but 2/3 of Republicans are backing that. And so an interesting potential policy change. And again, one of those exceptions I mentioned where solid majorities of all three partisan groups favor the same, or at least a similar policy proposal. Marijuana legalization, we just follow this a few times every year or two. The interesting thing here is not that it's strongly net favored, 69% in favor, but that we have crossed the point where half of Republicans favor it, 51%. I think we were at 50 the last time we asked it, so it hadn't moved much among Republicans, but that does seem like a worthwhile threshold to pay attention to and how the issue develops with similar huge majorities of independents and Democrats in favor. Taxes in schools. This is a long-running question. Is it more important to you to reduce property taxes or to increase public school spending? In 2012 and 13, plurality, just under 50%, favored reducing property taxes. Beginning in 2014 and following, the percent favoring more school spending went way up into the 60s and stayed there for a while, but the gap between these two has been narrowing since 2018, with just a small plurality or majority favoring more school spending, but a growing minority saying cut property taxes. This time, there's a little more of a difference in favor of school spending, 52% versus cutting property taxes, 43%. I'm not prepared to say that the trend has completely reversed, but it is a bigger gap in favor of schools this month than it was the last time we asked the question. Here, though, the party gap is gigantic or big. Let's save gigantic for some of those other issues, big. With Republicans much more concerned about property taxes than school spending. Remember a few minutes ago on the importance of issues? Taxes was much higher for Republicans and much lower for Democrats. And Democrats much more anxious to spend on schools. Independents a little bit in the middle, 40% taxes, 54% increased school spending. So the balance is pro-schools, but a substantial share of voters who are concerned about property taxes, even though it's minority at this point. Vouchers for schools. And here I want to urge you to hold off just a second because we've asked this question two different ways. And so I wanted to compare how the difference in the way you word a question about vouchers makes a difference to how people respond to it. So the question we had asked a few times in the past, including a year ago in August of last year, is the wording you see here. Would you favor or oppose expanding the number of students using publicly funded vouchers to attend private schools? This was the kind of argument that we heard in the legislature a few years ago about expanding vouchers. And in this survey, 46% favor an expansion, but 45% oppose. There's some pretty clear party gaps, but they're not the enormous party gaps that we've seen before. Now, the reason I cautioned you is these numbers look tighter than they were the last time we asked the question in April. And the reason is difference in ways the question is worded. And so last couple of times we asked it, we used a newer question wording, which was this one. Do you favor or oppose allowing all students statewide to use publicly funded vouchers to attend private or religious schools if they wish to do so? I moved to this question because I thought it captured a little bit more of what's going on now. But in April, when we asked this question, it was 58% in favor of expanding vouchers, 33% opposed. So if you compare the 58 last time with the 46 this time, you will come to an absolutely wrong conclusion that support for vouchers has plummeted. What you're really seeing is how different the framing of the question, how that matters for how people answer it. Now, I don't know that I'll spend a lot more time studying this question, but whether it's because the newer question mentions all students statewide, and the first question just says expanding the number of students. Well, if you're not familiar with the voucher program, you might not think that applies to where you live, whereas saying statewide does. So maybe that's part of the question. Maybe it's the if they wish to do so is sort of good feeling. I don't know the answer to that, but I wanted to make sure that given the difference in wording, I wanted to see how much difference do these two different wordings matter. And you can see they matter quite a lot. Which one is the truth? That's a much more difficult question, and we're not going to solve that. But an interesting issue, one worth taking account of, one that may be a policy issue in the coming years, or is a policy issue in the coming years. But how you address it is a big question. Okay. State headed in the right direction or wrong track? Oh my God, it's been so long since we saw the right track. It's disappeared in the distance. 56% wrong track, 35% right direction, hardly changed from 2 months ago. This has just been really negative for now a couple of years, having turned down in the mid-year of 2020 and has been negative and drifting more negative. The only thing is this one didn't move further negative this time, but it's still quite negative and big partisan gaps. Biden's job approval actually for once stayed steady, 40% last time, 40% this time. And his disapproval number actually ticked down by a couple of points from 57 to 55. So not much movement there. But after a period in which his approval has been drifting down nationally, interesting that it's flattened out, big party differences. Here's his job approval trend over time. And you can see the purple line is down just slightly this time, while the green line has been flat for 2 surveys, but down from the 3 before that and down from the summer of 2021. And finally, the other senator who's not up for election this year, Tammy Baldwin, slightly net favorable, 39 to 37, substantial party differences there. And with Senator Baldwin, 24% saying they don't have an opinion about her. That's less than don't have an opinion of Senator Johnson, but he's involved in a campaign right now. So Baldwin will have an election in another couple of years, so we'll hold on that. So that's it. We're done. I have all of 2 minutes, so I'm happy to try a question in 2 minutes, and I appreciate your putting up with me.
People have a local area code but don't live here anymore.
It's the other way around. They have an area code from Chicago, but they live in Milwaukee.
Okay.
It's all right-thinking
So
Chicago and should do.
People that have a 414 and live somewhere else.
No, they're not a problem for us because when we first get them on the phone, we ask if they live in Wisconsin and what county they live in.
You're not including
So if they foolishly move to Chicago, and no doubt even more foolishly become Bears fans. I realize there are a few Bears fans in this area, but you know, I'm a Packer patriot. It's the inbound that matters. And when we first started the poll in 2012, it was like 4% that had out of area codes in the state. But as that's moved up, we shifted our methodology so that we can capture that 16% and represent them in the survey. Yes.
On the favorable opinions and don't care, so forth. The ones that don't know, how much do you think that's attributed to the fact that they may have moved here recently? And that's would explain why they don't know the person, even though Ron Johnson's been in office for 12 years.
Right. There is, I'm sure, some element of that. It'd be interesting to look at it in places where we've had a lot of people moving into the state. or we don't actually ask how long you've lived in the state, but that would be a worthwhile thing to look into. I think it also has a lot to do with people who are only peripherally interested in politics. And there is a substantial share of folks in that category, and they start paying attention during the election campaign. And so by the time we get to November, that percentage don't know will probably drop to maybe 10% or so, but there'll still be 10% that don't want to venture an opinion about a name, especially on the favorabilities when we haven't identified this clearly as this is the senator running for re-election. But it is an interesting thing.
Charles, would you interpret what the poll told you about the public's reaction to the February 6th storming of Congress?
January 6th.
January 6th.
Yeah. Well, we didn't delve deeply into it. I think the first point is that lots of people are aware of that set of hearings. And so to push back against the notion that there's some people paying no attention to that whatsoever, that's not quite true. And the party difference is not that great. So people are being exposed to it. But then you look at does President Trump bear responsibility for the violence? Huge partisan gap. So that's where our political preferences shape how we're reacting to the testimony. It would be better if I had a much longer survey to ask people more details of what they've learned from the hearings. Do they have any idea who's been testifying or some of the details of that? We've asked a little bit of that on our national surveys, but not in deep detail. So I think there are messages getting out, but the reactions to the hearings are very much shaped by what people bring to it, their partisan filters. Also, we were in the field after the FBI served the search warrant in Mar-a-Lago, but that happened after we were already locked in on the questionnaire, so we didn't have anything about that. But you can look this up online. Trump's favorability numbers barely moved between the June survey and this survey. So again, the notion that the FBI serving the warrant boosted him substantially, we're not seeing much evidence of that in this poll in the immediate aftermath. Okay, I've run over, and that's something that if the dean were here, he would chastise me for, because we believe in making the railroad run on time, even if it's on the wrong track. So thank you so much for being here. We'll be back in September.